Imagine waking up at 72 and suddenly realizing that every criticism you've made about your spouse, every judgment passed on your children, every frustration felt toward neighbors, all of it was actually about you. Every pointed finger was a mirror, reflecting back what you couldn't bear to see in yourself. Picture this. You're in your kitchen when your partner does something that usually triggers irritation. But this time, instead of launching into that familiar lecture about their shortcomings, you pause. In that stillness, something profound hits you. What if everything you've been trying to fix in them is actually what needs healing in you? This isn't some new age fantasy or psychological theory. This is the revolutionary discovery that Carl Jung, one of history's most brilliant minds, called psychological projection. And it's been secretly running your life for decades without you knowing it. But here's where it gets truly unsettling. What if the very mechanism you've been using to protect your self-worth has actually been destroying it? What if every time you point out someone else's mistakes or judge their behavior, you're actually deepening your own prison of guilt and inadequacy? Think about the last argument you had with someone close to you. Remember how righteous you felt? How clear it seemed that they were the problem? Now consider this disturbing possibility. What if that entire conflict was actually your psyche's desperate attempt to avoid looking at something painful within yourself? This revelation becomes even more complex when you realize that at 60, 70, or 80, you've had decades to perfect this unconscious dance. You've become a master at spotting in others exactly what you fear most about yourself. Your critical eye has become so sharp that you can detect the smallest hint of laziness, selfishness, or weakness in everyone around you, while remaining completely blind to these same qualities within yourself. But why does this matter now, at this stage of your life? Because every projection you make, every judgment you cast, every time you make someone else responsible for your discomfort, you're giving away a piece of your power. You're handing over your ability to find genuine peace, authentic relationships, and true self-worth. Here's the paradox that will haunt you. The very thing you think is protecting your dignity is actually eroding it. The mechanism you believe is maintaining your self-respect is systematically destroying your capacity for genuine self-love. And the most tragic part? Most people carry this burden to their graves, never realizing that the key to their liberation was always in their own hands. They spend their final decades stuck in patterns of blame and criticism, wondering why relationships feel hollow and satisfaction remains elusive. What if I told you that Jung discovered not just the problem, but the precise solution? What if there was a way to break free from this psychological prison that doesn't require you to become a different person, but simply to see yourself, truly see yourself for the first time? The question that will either terrify you or set you free is this: are you ready to stop running from yourself and finally come home to who you really are? The journey we're about to take together will challenge everything you think you know about yourself and others. It will reveal the hidden mechanisms that have been shaping your relationships and emotions for decades. But more importantly, it will hand you the master key to unlock a freedom you may have forgotten was possible. Are you ready to discover Jung's most powerful insight and learn how to reclaim the self-worth that has been hiding in plain sight all along? If this resonates with you and you're ready to explore these profound truths, please subscribe to this channel and hit that like button. because what we're about to uncover together might just be the most important realization of your entire life. The uncomfortable truth Carl Jung discovered was that human beings possess an almost supernatural ability to see their own unconscious material projected outward onto other people. He called this psychological projection, but what he uncovered was far more sinister than a simple defense mechanism. It was a complete system of self-deception that keeps us trapped in cycles of judgment, blame, and emotional suffering. But why do we do this? Jung understood that projection serves a crucial psychological function. It protects the ego from information it's not ready to process. When you were younger, perhaps you couldn't afford to see your own aggression, neediness, or capacity for selfishness. These revelations might have threatened your survival or sense of identity. Friedrich Nietzsche, who profoundly influenced Jung's thinking, wrote about the human tendency to create moral systems that allow us to feel superior to others. He recognized that our harshest judgments often reveal our deepest fears about ourselves. When you criticize someone for being too emotional, you're likely defending against your own emotional vulnerability. Arthur Schopenhauer took this insight further, suggesting that we create entire worldviews based on what we refuse to acknowledge in ourselves. He observed that people often become passionate advocates for causes that secretly represent their own shadow material. The person who crusades against moral corruption may be fighting their own ethical compromises. Here's where Jung's insight becomes truly revolutionary. He discovered that the very qualities we most vehemently deny in ourselves become the qualities we're most sensitive to in others. Your radar for other people's faults is actually a map of your own unconscious terrain. The behaviors that trigger you most intensely are typically pointing directly toward your own disowned aspects. Jean-Paul Sartre explored this from an existential perspective, arguing that we often use others as a way to avoid the terrifying responsibility of authentic self-creation. When you make someone else the problem, you don't have to face the anxiety of examining your own choices, values, or contradictions. Viktor Frankl observes something profound about human nature. People will go to extraordinary lengths to avoid confronting their own capacity for both good and evil. He noticed that those who maintain their psychological health in extreme circumstances were often those who could acknowledge their own shadow without being destroyed by it. Jung noticed that projection intensifies when we feel our mortality approaching. The closer we get to life's end, the more urgent it becomes to maintain our sense of being good people. This creates what he called desperate goodness, a frantic attempt to preserve our self-image by making others the repository of everything we can't accept about ourselves. This is why many people become more critical and judgmental as they age. It's not that they're becoming worse people. They're becoming more desperate to maintain their psychological defenses against truths they fear would destroy them. Jung understood that projection isn't just about individual psychology, it's about the fundamental human struggle with wholeness. We are complex beings containing contradictory impulses and opposing tendencies. The healthy response is integration, learning to hold paradox without needing to resolve it. The unhealthy response is splitting, separating the good parts of ourselves from the bad parts and projecting the latter onto others. Projection serves one more crucial function. It preserves the illusion of control. When problems exist out there in other people, We maintain the fantasy that we could solve everything if only those people would change. This allows us to avoid accepting what we cannot control, while taking responsibility for what we can. What Jung discovered about the long-term effects of chronic projection was perhaps more disturbing than the mechanism itself. He found that people who live their entire lives deflecting their shadow material onto others don't just damage their relationships. They systematically erode their own capacity for genuine self-worth and authentic connection. The first invisible consequence is emotional dysregulation through externalization. When you consistently make other people responsible for your internal discomfort, you lose touch with your own emotional landscape. Your feelings become dependent on others' behavior rather than arising from your own experience. This creates chronic emotional reactivity, where your peace of mind is always at the mercy of circumstances beyond your control. When your adult child makes a decision you disapprove of, your distress isn't really about their choice. It's about what their choice represents about your own parenting, values, or sense of control. But because you focus on their mistake, you never develop skills to process your own anxiety, disappointment, or fear. The neurological research confirms Jung's observations. Brain imaging shows that people who habitually engage in projection develop different neural pathways than those who practice self-reflection. The projection pattern literally rewires the brain to look outward for sources of discomfort rather than inward for understanding. Over decades, this creates external attribution bias, a brain that has lost much of its capacity for genuine introspection. Jung noticed that chronic projectors often develop relationship shadows, unconscious patterns that sabotage their connections with others. When you're constantly monitoring people for evidence of their flaws, you create an atmosphere of judgment that makes authentic intimacy impossible. Think about people who bring out your most critical side. Notice how you become hyper-focused on their shortcomings while remaining blind to your own contributions. This isn't accidental. It's your psyche using these relationships as dumping grounds for disowned aspects of yourself. Schopenhauer observed that projection creates a particularly insidious form of suffering because it generates the pain of false superiority. When you derive your sense of worth from being better than others, you trap yourself in constant comparison and competition. Your self-esteem becomes dependent on maintaining your position in an imaginary hierarchy rather than on genuine self-acceptance. The existential consequences are perhaps most profound. Sartre argued that projection represents fundamental bad faith, a denial of your own freedom and responsibility. When you make other people the source of your problems, you avoid confronting the terrifying truth that you are free to choose your responses to life. Viktor Frankl noticed something particularly tragic about people who had spent decades engaged in projection. They often reached life's end feeling fundamentally disconnected from themselves. Having spent so much energy monitoring and criticizing others, they never developed a genuine relationship with their own inner experience. But perhaps the most heartbreaking consequence is what Jung called the impoverishment of the personality. When you disown significant aspects of yourself by projecting them onto others, you literally diminish your own psychological richness. The parts you refuse to acknowledge don't disappear. They just become unavailable to your conscious experience. This leaves you feeling somehow incomplete. The most tragic aspect of these consequences is that they're largely invisible to the person experiencing them. The very mechanism that creates the problems also creates blindness to the problems. People trapped in chronic projection patterns often feel justified and clear about where the problems lie. They just never suspect that the problems might be closer to home than they imagine. The cumulative effect of decades of projection is a life lived in emotional exile from yourself, surrounded by relationships that feel somehow unsatisfying, experiencing a chronic sense that if only other people would change, everything would be better. But the change that's actually needed is the one thing the projection pattern makes almost impossible to see. The path to freedom from projection begins with what Jung called the most terrifying moment in a person's life: the decision to turn toward yourself with the same intensity you've been directing toward others. This isn't about becoming self-absorbed. It's about finally taking responsibility for your own psychological territory. The first step is developing what Jung termed active imagination, combined with radical self-honesty. Learn to ask yourself a revolutionary question whenever you find yourself irritated or critical of someone else. What aspect of myself am I seeing reflected in this person? This question will initially feel absurd, even offensive. Your ego will protest, but they really are being unreasonable. This resistance is actually a good sign. It means you're approaching the edge of a significant psychological breakthrough. Nietzsche understood this process when he wrote about becoming who you are. He recognized that most people spend their lives becoming who they think they should be, rather than discovering who they actually are. The rebellion against projection requires what he called amor fati, learning to love your fate, including the aspects of yourself you've been trying to disown. The practical work begins with Jung's shadow work, deliberately reclaiming disowned aspects of your personality. This means recognizing and accepting qualities in yourself that you've been attributing to others. When you catch yourself judging someone for being too sensitive, practice asking, "How am I too sensitive? When do I react emotionally in ways I don't like to acknowledge?" Viktor Frankl developed paradoxical intention for this work. Instead of trying to eliminate uncomfortable aspects of yourself, you deliberately practice acknowledging them with humor and acceptance. If you've been projecting your neediness onto others, practice saying, "I'm a person who has needs, and sometimes I'm quite needy. This is part of my humanity, not a character flaw." But the deepest level of this rebellion requires what Carl Jung called holding the tension of opposites. Instead of splitting yourself into good and bad parts, you learn to embrace what he termed the transcendent function, the ability to hold contradictory aspects of yourself simultaneously without needing to resolve the contradiction. This might mean acknowledging, "I am both generous and selfish. I am both wise and foolish. I am both loving and capable of cruelty." This isn't about becoming resigned to your flaws. It's about developing the psychological maturity to hold complexity without demanding simplicity. Schopenhauer provided another crucial insight. He recognized that most suffering comes from resistance to reality rather than from reality itself. When you stop resisting the reality of your own humanity, including the parts you don't particularly like, you discover that these aspects of yourself are much less threatening than your resistance to them. The social dimension of this rebellion requires what Sartre called authentic being with others. This means learning to relate to people based on who they actually are, rather than on what they represent to your unconscious mind. It means giving up the secret hope that changing other people will fix your internal discomfort. A crucial part of this process is developing what Jung called conscious suffering. Instead of automatically transferring your discomfort onto others through blame and criticism, you learn to sit with difficult emotions without immediately needing to escape them. This builds what he termed psychological holding capacity, the ability to contain intense experiences without fragmenting or projecting. The rebellion also requires learning to distinguish between legitimate boundaries and projective blame. There's a difference between saying, "I don't want to be treated this way," and saying, "You are a terrible person for treating me this way." The first is a boundary. The second is a projection. Perhaps most importantly, this liberation process requires what Jung called the development of compassion through self-knowledge. As you become more aware of your own shadows and contradictions, you naturally develop more compassion for the struggles of others. You stop needing them to be perfect because you've given up the illusion of your own perfection. The ultimate rebellion against projection is the decision to become responsible for your own emotional life while allowing others the dignity of their own journey. This creates space for relationships based on genuine intimacy rather than unconscious psychological exchange. This path isn't easy, but it leads to something most people never experience: the profound peace that comes from finally coming home to yourself. The ultimate truth Carl Jung discovered, and that will either liberate you completely or challenge everything you thought you knew about human nature, is this: the very qualities you most desperately try to hide from yourself are often the keys to your greatest gifts, deepest wisdom, and most authentic power. This isn't the comfortable truth that everyone has flaws. This is the revolutionary recognition that what you call your shadow, those aspects you've been projecting onto others for decades, contains not just your capacity for destruction, but also your capacity for profound creativity, authentic strength, and genuine love. Jung spent years studying what he called the alchemical process of individuation and made a startling discovery. People who learned to integrate their shadow material didn't just become more psychologically healthy, they became more fully alive, more creative, and more capable of authentic connection than they had ever imagined possible. Consider what this means for your life right now. That criticism you've been directing toward your partner for being too emotional? What if your own emotional capacity, which you've been suppressing, contains the key to deeper intimacy than you've ever experienced? That judgment you hold against people who seem selfish. What if learning to honor your own needs would actually make you more genuinely generous? Nietzsche understood this when he wrote about the revaluation of all values. He recognized that most of what we call morality is actually a sophisticated system for avoiding the full spectrum of human experience. What if the very qualities you've been taught to suppress contain the seeds of your most authentic contribution to the world? But Jung's insight goes even deeper. He discovered that projection isn't just a defense mechanism. It's actually a misguided attempt at integration. When you project your shadow onto others, you're unconsciously trying to relate to disowned aspects of yourself. The problem isn't that you're seeing these qualities. The problem is that you're seeing them in the wrong place. This leads to the most profound realization of all. Every person who irritates you, every individual who triggers your judgment, every relationship that brings out your critical side is actually offering you a gift. They're showing you exactly what you need to reclaim within yourself to become whole. Schopenhauer wrote about the world as will and representation, recognizing that external reality often serves as a mirror for internal processes. What Jung added was the recognition that this mirroring isn't random, it's purposeful. Your psyche is constantly creating opportunities for you to encounter and integrate your disowned material. This means that the people who challenge you most aren't obstacles to your peace. They're invitations to your wholeness. The colleague who seems arrogant might be showing you where you need to develop healthy confidence. A family member who appears needy might be reflecting your own unacknowledged need for support and connection. Viktor Frankl observed something remarkable about people who had undergone profound psychological transformation. They often described their former problems as having been essential to their development. What they had once seen as their greatest weaknesses had become their sources of greatest strength and compassion. The spiritual implications of this realization are staggering. If Jung is correct, then your liberation doesn't require you to become a different person. It requires you to become more fully the person you already are, including the aspects you've been afraid to acknowledge. This leads to what Jung called the paradox of wholeness. The more you accept your capacity for what you consider negative qualities, the more access you have to genuine positive qualities. When you stop using enormous amounts of energy to maintain a false image of yourself, that energy becomes available for authentic creativity, love, and contribution. But perhaps the most transformative aspect of this realization is what it means for your relationships. When you stop needing other people to carry your shadow projections, you free them to be themselves. This creates space for what Jung called authentic encounter, relationships based on genuine recognition rather than unconscious psychological exchange. The practical result of this realization is what mystics call effortless action, the ability to respond to life from wholeness rather than from fragmentation. When you're not constantly fighting aspects of yourself, you have access to your full range of human responses. You can be appropriately assertive without being aggressive, genuinely compassionate without being codependent, authentically confident without being arrogant. This is the supreme truth that changes everything. You are not broken and in need of fixing. You are complete and in need of integration. The very things you've been trying to eliminate or project onto others are often the missing pieces of your own puzzle. At 60, 70, or 80 years old, you have the opportunity to undertake the most important journey of your lifetime. Not the journey to become someone better, but the journey to discover who you've always been, beneath the layers of projection, defense, and psychological hiding. The ultimate realization is that coming home to yourself, shadows and light, strengths and vulnerabilities, wisdom and foolishness, is not just the path to personal peace. It's the greatest gift you can offer to everyone whose life you touch. Your wholeness gives others permission to be whole. Your authenticity creates space for authentic relationship. Your integration of shadow and light illuminates the path for others who are still fighting themselves. This is Jung's greatest gift to humanity, the recognition that becoming fully human isn't about perfecting yourself. It's about embracing yourself so completely that you naturally extend that same compassion to everyone you encounter. The journey ends where it began, with you. But now you know what you're looking for. We'd love to hear about your own journey with projection and self-discovery. What shadows have you learned to integrate? How has embracing your full humanity changed your relationships and your sense of peace? Share your insights in the comments below. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear on their own path to wholeness. If this exploration has resonated with you, please subscribe to this channel and give this video a like. The work of becoming whole is the most important work any of us can do, and it's work we do better together.